One of my favorite sayings in business, and something that I think about all the time, is a message that was drilled into my head by a mentor of mine. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It sounds simple enough, right? But it brings up a bigger question. How do we measure the success of a podcast, both against the standards of the goals and outcomes that we'd like to achieve, but also the expectations of listeners and the greater podcasting universe? In today's episode, we're talking about why you need to have goals for your podcast, how to implement actionable strategies for these goals, and most importantly, how to measure the growth and success of your progress along the way. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. About a month ago, I talked with a group of about 50 or so podcasters about what their goals were for their podcast in 2024, and here are some of their answers. To stay consistent with one episode per week, to create more segments, to have 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, to not quit doing it. It gets hard sometimes when the growth really isn't there. To stop worrying about what works and focus on what works for me. To keep pushing positivity and producing valuable information. To be in the top 10% of podcasts on listen notes. To actually launch my first episode. To continue being consistent and launch a private podcast / monetize. To inspire just one person. That last one I actually saw 6 times. 6 out of 50 podcasters said that their biggest goal for 2024 was to inspire or make an impact on just one listener. And while I think that's a very modest goal overall, I think that's something we should all be striving for in the greater context of our podcasting mission. Create your podcast with one person in mind. Make it your mission to impact one person. And whether that's literally or figuratively, commit yourself to creating content and a podcast that will speak to someone and actually help them. You need goals for your podcast, point blank. There's not one podcaster on this planet, no matter the genre, audience size, vibe, whatever you want to call it, we all need goals. Not just for the growth of the podcast, which is important, but for the sustainability of your excitement and passion for this project. Podcasting is a marathon, and if you don't have those small milestones to check off along the way and gauge if you're actually doing a good job or not, will make it really hard to keep going. Think about it like this. An actual marathon is 26.2 miles. What if someone took you out into the middle of nowhere, they drop you off, and they just said, okay, keep running until you get to mile 26.2 at the end? That would be torture, right? As someone who has ran a marathon, mentally, I don't think I could do it. I don't think even in my most prime physical shape, completely prepared to run a marathon, I could run 26.2 miles without being able to see mile markers. Because just like in a marathon, having the motivation and drive to continue a podcast is really all in your head. But now, imagine someone drops you into the middle of nowhere, but just ahead where you can see, you have a 0.25 miles. Then you start running a little bit and you pass the half a mile. Then after that, you pass a mile, 2 miles. Now keep going. Is it still going to be difficult? Yes. But do you now have a reference point to keep you motivated and to keep you accountable to the greater goal? Also, yes. This is why I encourage podcasters to have relevant goals. And this can look like so many different things. For example, I'll give you my goal for this very podcast that you're listening to at the current moment. So my goal is to grow listenership and total downloads by 10% month over month. I'm not great at math, so this is a good number for me. And more importantly, I found that it is challenging but achievable. And we'll get back to the importance of that in just a minute. But basically, if I have 10,000 downloads this month, I know next month I'm looking for 11,000 and 12,100 the next month. I'm building by 10% every month, and I'm taking the time out of the first day of each month to really hold myself accountable. And if you're able to do this, go ahead and mark off 2 hours of your calendar on the first day of every month, just to look over the numbers for your podcast and also in your business and in your life. I'm going to make you a first of the month audit that will be a download that's available in the show notes. But I'm going to walk you through right now what I think every podcaster should be doing on the first day of every month. Whether you're charting this on the download that you got from me, or you're just using a blank piece of paper or a note on your computer, it doesn't really matter. It's all going to be the same. But take the time to write down these metrics and look at what's happened from last month to this month. Because what's the moral of the story? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you don't know where you're starting, you don't know where you need to go. So the first thing is open up your podcast hosting site. So that's going to be Buzzsprout, Podbean, Lisbon, whatever you use. And look at how many downloads that you've got this month. Write down that total number of downloads for the month. Now, compare it to last month. Is it more or is it less? Write this down and then write down what your best performing episode was for the last month. How many downloads did it get? Why do you think it was your best performing episode? How can you create more content like that episode? See where I'm going with all this? After that, you're going to look at your 3 best performing episodes of all time and answer these questions for me. What do these episodes have in common? Why do I think my audience is connecting with these episodes specifically? How can I create another episode this month that shares a characteristic with one of these episodes, and what could that be? Lastly, my goal for this month is to get, insert number of downloads here, number of downloads on my podcast. Like I said earlier, I'd make this a percentage of the number of downloads and keep that pretty streamlined every month. So maybe you have 1,000 downloads this month. So next month, if you're trying to look at a growth of 10%, you'd multiply 1,000 by 0.1. Add those figures together, and your goal for this month will be 1,100. After that, I want you to get on 2 free websites. So this will be to look up your global ranking and your Apple Podcast chart rankings of your show. The first will be listennotes.com. This is where you can find your global ranking across all podcasts across the world, which is pretty cool, and your listen score, which is allegedly the consumption rate of your episodes. I've had some serious questions about Listen Notes overall and how they get these numbers and percentages, but that's an episode for another day. Overall, this website is recognized as the ranking standard amongst many podcasters, like I said. So do I find it to be 100% accurate? No, but we're working with what we have. The next is chartable.com. This website is incredibly finicky and annoying. I just want to say that before we really get into it. Don't pay for it. There are way better ranking and tracking websites out there. This one will just tell you if you are ranking on any Apple Podcast charts for free, and that's the reason that we're doing it. Also, if anyone from Chartable is listening to this, please send me an email. I would love to help with your user interface to create a website that people can actually bear to use. But for now, it is free. So from Chartable and Listen Notes, write down what your global rankings are. If you don't see one, you are not yet globally ranked. So that is a great long-term goal to set for yourself. If you are, go ahead and write down what your listen score is. The global ranking and the listen score will both be on Listen Notes. Again, if you are not ranked, you will not have a listen score. Write down any rankings that you have on Chartable, what they are, what country they're in. If you don't see any, you are not ranking. Don't let this get you down. Let it be an opportunity for you to set a goal that you are ranking. We all have to start somewhere. You're going to do this every first day of the month, every month. Go ahead, file it away, keep it so that you can review it and you can look at your progress month over month. There is nothing more satisfying. There is nothing that is going to jazz you up more than seeing how your podcast is actually growing. But in the meantime, along the way, I want you to start a note in your phone or a document on your computer or just write it down on a piece of paper. Every positive thing someone says about your podcast or a way that your podcast has helped them. So anytime you get a comment, anytime you get a DM, anything anyone has to say to you, go ahead and write it down with the date and exactly what they said and who they are. I started doing this when I was working in a corporate job because sometimes like having a podcast at corporate job can feel very defeating. It can feel like no one is listening and you are just screaming into the void. So even if your mom just says, honey, you're doing a great job. I love your podcast. I want you to take a moment and write it down because these are the things that are going to keep you going when the going gets tough. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned it was important to have challenging but actionable goals. If you're familiar with SMART goals, you've heard of this before, but any goal you have for anything needs to be SMART. And that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. You can have big goals for your podcast, and I hope that you do. I pray that you do, but they need to be achievable. You can have a goal to make $1 million in revenue this year from monetizing your show. But if you only have 10 listeners, the achievability of that goal without some major luck or divine intervention is pretty unlikely. So make sure your goals are relevant to your current situation and that you're able to enforce specific steps to get you there. Here's a really good example, and I'm taking it from something that I hear a lot. Instead of saying you want a sponsor for your show by the end of the year, say you will reach out to 10 potential sponsors every month until the end of 2024 with the intention of getting at least 2 sponsorship opportunities that are over $500 each. That way you have specific steps reaching out to 10 potential sponsors, right? You're able to measure if you've been able to do that task or not. If you were able to secure 2 sponsorships that were at least $500. It's time-bound because we're saying it's going to be by the end of 2024 and reaching out to 10 sponsors each month, another time-bound goal. It's relevant to your objective of making money to keep the podcast going. So see what I did there? We kind of changed it a little bit from just saying, oh, I want a sponsor, to this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to make it happen. And this is how I'm going to measure the way that I'm making it happen. Just saying a random thing that you want for your podcast, for example, having a sponsor, is so vague and unmotivating because there's no way to track the progress or hold yourself accountable or really even know if you're going to be able to get the end result. In my experience, the majority of podcasters want to quit their podcast because they feel like it isn't working, quote unquote, it isn't working. It isn't giving them the results that they thought it would. But most of the time, when I ask what working would mean, they don't really have a clear answer on that either. No matter what phase of your podcasting journey that you're in, whether you're thinking about starting a podcast or you have 10 episodes or you have 1,000 episodes, you need to know what success looks like for this podcast, or it's never really going to evolve past the point that it's currently at. Again, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So just feeling good about your podcast isn't really a goal. People liking it isn't really a goal. But what is a goal is getting 10 5-star reviews next month, being featured in an industry-specific newsletter by the end of the year, getting 100 more downloads than you did last month, getting 2 leads that convert into a paying customer over the next quarter, being asked to be featured as a guest on a podcast with a way bigger audience than yours, to air your episodes consistently on the same day at the same time, or to make 50 episodes. These are all amazing goals. If you're having trouble making goals for your podcast, as always, I want you to think about why you started. If your goal is to impact one person, that's amazing. But what kind of impact? What does that really mean to you? What do you want people to say about your podcast when you aren't in the room? Where do you see your podcast this time next year? What about in 5 years? What kind of opportunities do you want to gain as a result of your podcast? And how are you going to position it to get those results? Wow, so I know this episode has been a lot of information, and you might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now. Or maybe you're feeling super motivated, but you aren't sure where to start because this has been a lot, right? Go ahead and download the month progress tracker that's going to be in the show notes and in the episode description. Print that out or save it onto your computer. And at the beginning of next month, start from there. Fill it out. Small, consistent effort over time leads to the greatest outcomes. You can do this. There is nothing special about the podcasters you want to be like. other than they stuck to it and they took the small steps, and so can you. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.